sticking around. I'm going to also tweet, make sure we get some more extra. Anybody that's just kind of surfing the web right now, we'll get them in, we'll scoop them in.
Awesome.
All right. So thanks, Michael, for joining us. And we've already had David and Joy earlier. And now
nice.
we're going to hear
Excellent.
about best practices in naming, organizing, structuring Microsoft Teams.
Thanks, buddy. Good luck with your
take it away.
Good luck with your meeting.
All righty. I'll probably be back early. I'll see you.
Okay,
Thanks.
no worries. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me in this session to talk all about naming, organizing, and structuring Microsoft Teams. A pretty hot topic, I think, with so many organizations using Microsoft Teams across various different use cases. First of all, special thank you to our sponsor. I don't know who this is. Whoever they are, go and visit them because they are sponsoring this event. So please make sure you go and kind of chat with them. A little bit about myself. So my name is Michael. I'll be here for about the next hour. Now, by the way, I have to apologize. I have the same virus that everyone seems to have, this kind of chest infection thing. So if you see me go off camera or go off chat, I'm probably either blowing my nose or I am coughing. So again, I apologize for that. So a little bit about myself. So lots of experience within Microsoft 365 and SharePoint in particular. I currently work for a company called Orchestra. We have an adoption and a governance platform and lots of customers, which really lets us have some pretty unique views in terms of how customers are structuring Microsoft Teams, what names work, what names don't work, what are some of the best kind of practices that we've seen. And again, what we're actually going to be doing is talking about all of these things. So we can help structure your teams effectively, right? Not just have all of these teams with a single channel and a bunch of crazy names. We're going to make sure that all of that is going to be really well done for you. If you have any questions for myself, feel free to email me. Chat with me, put questions within the chat here as well. I'm more than happy to answer them at any time. Company I work for is called Orchestra. We are a governance and adoption and a lifecycle management platform for Microsoft 365. Again, won't do the hard sell on you, but really kind of fantastic set of suite of tools, both helping customers to manage some of the governance challenges that they have, and especially around provisioning and team structure, and also helping from an adoption perspective. And this session's kind of interesting because, again, a lot of this is really going to be driven by data. So we have lots of customers, we process lots of teams, and of course, through all of our customers, we've managed to see certain patterns, certain conventions, and certain things that work better than others. And we know that a lot of organizations are struggling with things like team sprawl, Microsoft Teams adoption. So I'm hoping that at the end of this session, there's going to be some really good information for you. If you're interested in Orchestra, just reach out to us. I'm more than happy to set you up with a demo as well to help you understand your environment or help you drive the usage of Microsoft Teams a little bit quicker. The agenda for today. So first thing we're going to talk about is some session goals. We always do this at the very beginning, just so it gives you a chance to jump out 5 minutes into the presentation, as opposed to having to wait like 20, 30 minutes. And you're like, I really didn't want to listen to this guy talk. So we'll talk about some session goals. Then we'll talk about naming and why naming really matters for Teams and SharePoint sites and everything else. Then we'll talk about naming in terms of teams, channels, and tab naming in particular. So what you should call your teams, what are some really good naming conventions around teams and SharePoint sites, what are some naming conventions around channels and around tabs as well. And then we're going to kind of bring all of these things together with some best practices in terms of how to structure your Microsoft Teams. Again, far too many organizations that we see, their teams is just like a single team, right? General channel only. There's nothing else there. Maybe they have some conversations in there, but they're not using any of the additional capabilities that Microsoft 365 provides. And there's a lot of really simple, really effective things that you can do in terms of adding additional channels or additional tabs or embedding additional apps that we're going to talk about also. And then the final thing we'll do is put it all together. So we'll go through some examples of 3 kind of Teams templates that we've seen work really well. One of them is going to be based around a particular project scenario. Everyone does projects, so it's a pretty good one to work with. One of them is going to be based around a department, and the other one is going to be based around an employee onboarding team as well. So you can see how you can put all of these pieces together. Some session goals. So first thing, we're going to talk about again, why naming matters for teams, channels, and tabs. We see this in a lot of organizations where, in many organizations, teams are just created haphazardly and people have different names for things and people get really, really confused. So we'll talk about why those names matter. Then we'll talk about, again, some of the components that you can add to your teams and to your SharePoint sites to make that a little bit easier. Then we'll see some examples of putting all of these things together. But the biggest thing that we really want you to get out of this session is around some practical examples, right? One, not just to be a high-level philosophy session, but really practical things that you can take back. So maybe some of the things that I talk about in terms of naming conventions can be really, really useful, or how to structure your teams, or even how to structure those SharePoint sites with the teams as well. All right, let's get going here. I'm going to grab a drink here before my voice goes. And it's not COVID, by the way, if people are wondering. It's some sort of weird respiratory thing that everyone seems to have, which is very, very frustrating. All right, so let's talk about naming teams, channels, and tabs for success. So the first thing really is, why does this kind of matter, and why is it important? As you know, naming is pretty important, right, for most things. And to be honest with you, people are really terrible at naming things, right? I mean, they're terrible at naming documents and files and folders. They seem to be really, really bad at naming SharePoint sites and teams also. And again, this could really have a long-term impact on information findability, how people can find teams or SharePoint sites. And really, one of the main reasons for this is that Microsoft Teams really doesn't help you much either. Out of the box, anyone can create anything. Those Azure naming policies, again, are very, very simple. So there is a way to use some naming policies, which we'll talk about, but they're really, really simple. There's no real way to enforce naming for channels or tabs. And of course, if you change the name of your teams or your SharePoint site, there is some unforeseen kind of impacts that it can have. And what you end up with is something like this, right? So we've got a nicely named team here with a prefix. Of course, there's always someone, right, who wants to create a team called Michael's Lunch Test to test something out. People using emojis in these team names and to these channel names also can be really problematic. The other thing, which is a huge issue, is that in Teams, you can go and create the name of the same team as many times as you want. So we see this a lot in terms of duplication, where people are going in and creating a team. Let's say they call it human resources. They don't invite everyone in. Someone else comes in. They then go and create another team, or they look for that human resources team. They can't find it because it's private. And then what happens? They go and create another team with the same name. All of a sudden, you've got two teams called human resources, and then you get a whole bunch of issues with that as well. We also see a whole bunch of team names like this, like 1 or 2 or 3, right? Again, it's people not knowing what they're doing either. But again, it is very important to have those teams named correctly so people can find what they're looking for, and you can take advantage of some of those collaboration pieces. So what are some of the common issues with bad naming, right? So why should we care about naming? And there's really kind of 4 things that we know are going to cause issues. So one of them is going to be around the findability of existing teams. So again, without a good naming convention, it's going to be really difficult to be able to go and find existing teams effectively. Now, one of the reasons for that is that the team search isn't very good. I would go so far to say as it's pretty horrible. And the reason for that is that when you go into Teams and through the Teams client and do a team search, the search is actually a starts with search. So what that means is that if you've got a search term in the middle of the word, so let's say Project Alpha, if you go into Teams and if you do a search for project, you're going to find that Project Alpha team. If you do a search for Alpha, you're not going to find that team, right? And that's a real issue as well, because what typically happens is that even though that team exists or that SharePoint site exists, someone's going to not know that it exists and they're going to go and create a duplicate team, which is the second point. The second point is around duplicated teams. Now, we see this all the time across all of our customers, where people are creating teams which essentially has the same kind of context, but they call it something different. So we'll have a team called Human Resources, HR, Human Resources - 2022, HR team, all of these pieces. And the issue with duplicated teams in particular is once you have duplicate team, so you've got more than one team kind of working on the same thing, it's very difficult to be able to merge these things together. there's no concept within Microsoft 365 to be able to merge kind of channels and documents and SharePoint sites and users together within duplicate teams. There is third-party tools that do that also, but again, they don't really do a great job, particularly around bringing in the conversations either. So it can be a huge issue. The third thing is around lack of context as well, right? So again, not having really good names for your teams is going to make it really difficult for people to understand what's the context of that team. What exactly is in there or should be in there? So if I go into a team and it's called human resources, like, is that the human resources department? Is it a project for human resources, right? It's difficult to get that context if you have some kind of really simple names. And the last thing you're going to get is a ton of sprawl of teams and channels. And we see that a lot with our customers. We see lots of sprawl, lots of duplication of teams, and all that really leads to is this kind of wasteland of unused or abandoned teams, where organizations create these teams, create these SharePoint sites, they might use them for a little bit of time, but then they never use them again. So where is the team's name shown, or the name of the actual team? So again, there's a few pieces. So again, the name of the team is going to be shown into the Teams app itself. It's going to also be part of that SharePoint site, as well as the Microsoft 365 group. It's going to be part of the email address, and there's a bunch of other places as well. So again, having great names can really help you with things like findability, things like context. So who is this team for? Who owns it? What's its purpose? And then finally, what's actually in this team? So how do we get some good team names? So some things to do. The first thing that we recommend for teams naming in particular is to consider the use of prefixes. So prefixes is some sort of identifier that every team is going to have before that team is created. Again, we typically recommend that you use acronyms for prefixes. We'll talk a little bit around what some of those acronyms are. But again, having these things prefixed with maybe PRJ because it's a project, for example, or DEPT because it's a department is really going to help people understand the context of that team and also when it should be used. In terms of the prefixes, what we recommend is limiting it to 12 characters overall. The reason for that is that in that team's client, doesn't matter how wide your screen is, if you have one of these crazy wide monitors, I think it cuts off the name. I think it's around 28 characters. We've got it later on. So don't have too many prefixes, because then the people aren't going to see the name of the team itself, but at least have some prefixes. And we'll talk about how you can structure those prefixes in just a moment also. The other thing is around spaces as well. So again, spaces make it a little bit easier for people to find teams within the Teams client. To be honest with you, it doesn't really matter whether you're using spaces or underscores, because the team search is so useless. But again, having spaces, particularly for things like project names, can be really useful also. Third thing that you want to consider is around duplication. So again, we see this as a huge issue with a lot of our customers, that you have these kind of duplicated teams. And like I said, unfortunately, out of the box, Microsoft 365 is going to allow you to do that. So if you see this little example down below here, it's very easy to go and create 50 teams called human resources, right? The Teams client is going to allow you to do that. There's no real way to block that out of the box. Again, what you can do to combat that is a couple of things. So one of them is to make your teams public instead of private. Now, I know that's not the ultimate kind of thing that you can do in all cases, but at least if the team is public, people can search for those teams. They can find the human resource team, and then they don't have to go and create another one, which is a duplicate, for example. The other thing that can be really useful is having something like a Teams or a SharePoint site directory. So again, we see this something which is really common, the idea that there's a central directory of maybe all of the teams or all of the team sites that people can see. In a lot of cases, you might also want to give people the ability to see at least the name of the team or the SharePoint site that they might not necessarily have access to, so at least they know that thing exists, and then they can go and request access for it also. And the last thing to talk about is around length. And I think someone asked this, so great question, Joy. How many characters do you want to have in your team name? Now, we've actually conducted significant scientific research on this matter, Turns out the answer is 29, right? After 29, what's going to happen is in the Teams client itself, it is going to start to get the ... thing. Whereas on the SharePoint side, you can actually have as many as you want because that SharePoint header is much, much bigger. So again, keep that in mind, right? You want to make sure that you don't go prefix and suffix crazy. If you have too many prefixes, the name is going to get truncated like we see below here. If you have too many suffixes, there's going to be ... dots there. So again, around about 29 is where you want to land. And again, the reason for that is if you have more than 29, it's going to start to get cut off here. So people aren't going to be able to see the actual things also. So now that we know some of these practices, how can we approach the naming of teams? So what are some of the approaches that we have? So again, there's a few approaches that you can use. One of them is not to use anything, right? And I think a lot of organizations do that. If you don't really have any teams names or SharePoint naming conventions, what you're probably going to end up with is a ton of sprawl, a ton of duplication of content, and probably 20 teams called human resources or something like that. The other thing that you can also do, and most organizations have access to this, is use an Azure AD P1 naming policy. Now, again, this is an out-of-the-box feature. The problem with this in particular is that it's only at the group level, which is kind of a little bit, frankly, useless because you're not going to have the same prefix for every single team, right? It doesn't make sense. You might want to have, like I said, PRJ for projects and DEPT for departments, and maybe HR dash onboarding if you're onboarding a new employee, for instance. But out of the box, you just get to have it at the group level. So it can be useful, but it's not really the solution that most organizations need. You can obviously do manual governance rules also as well. We just find this doesn't work. If you train people on how they should structure their team names, what essentially happens is people read it, they forget it, and in the heat of the moment of them requesting a team or a SharePoint site or a group, they never do it. The last thing that you can do is use third-party tools. So again, tools like Orchestra, there's a ton of Power Apps as well, which can kind of help the provisioning type of things, and you can have these naming policies as part of them tools themselves to make it really simple and really easy. Next thing that you also might want to consider, and this is a good option, especially out of the box, is around blocked words. So again, this is an Azure AD P1 capability that essentially allows you to block particular words from people when they go and they request a team or a SharePoint site. Some of the things that you might want to block, for instance, things like people's names. Now, again, if you're using it for onboarding, you probably don't. The reason that we suggest that you block people's names, it stops people like me coming in and creating a team calling it Michael's lunch test or David's test or whatever else. That's a really common thing that people do. Blocking people's names at least helps them to think about that. Also, a lot of people put privacy within their team names also. This can be okay in some circumstances. We'll talk about this. But again, you also might want to block this for people so they don't put privacy in those channel names because it's all the team names, because of course that's gonna change. Things like test, demo, TST, temp, again, making this just available for IT is a good example. Again, this stops people from creating teams called blah, blah, blah test, right? Which a lot of organizations have. The other thing we also recommend is acronyms. So again, a lot of people, if they're in particular types of organizations or particular types of industries here, they use a ton of acronyms within their team's names. These can work if these are really well-known acronyms, but again, it might not. The other thing you might want to control as well is primary names. So one of the things is you might want to control, people being able to create a team called human resources, right? If there's already one there, or department names as well. So you can control all of those pieces. So some naming examples. One of the first things that we really like as well is probably the first thing is around static prefixes for teams or SharePoint sites based on the team type or function. So again, for projects, it could be something like PRJ or PROJ. For department teams, it could be something like DEPT. For clients, having something like a client ID can be really, really useful. If you're running committees, having COMM also. And again, for class, if you're an educational institution, also it could be class. So again, this can be really, really useful. Again, again, the nice thing around that is if you have these prefixes based on team type or function, you can instantly see what the purpose of that team is. The other thing that we also find is a lot of organizations like to have the department or the business unit acronym in there as well. Location is a common one also, and then also access as well. And I know we talked about this not having public and private in there, but for a lot of organizations, having things like guest access as well can be really useful. So people instantly know that this team has guests, for example. So what does this look like? So on the left-hand side, we have got some teams. These aren't really that badly named, to be honest with you, compared to some of the other stuff that we've seen, right? So we've got the market project team, we've got the digital initiative here, US sales, retail, Contoso, right? Pretty good team names, I would say. But just adding a few naming conventions really allows you to put some particular context through here. So for instance, we know that for now, the project alpha launch, the market project team, and the product beta launch, these are all projects, right? Because we have PRJ in front of them and maybe a unique product ID here. We know that retail and US sales, these are both departments, for instance, right? Because we've got the EPT in front of here. We also know that Contoso here, this particular team is part of the USA region and the HR department here. And again, it can make it really, really simple and really, really easy for people to provide that context also. So again, some common examples, projects, PRJ or PROJ dash the project ID and a descriptive name can be really useful. For departments, we typically see organizations prefixing with DEPT. For guests in particular, we see a lot of organizations putting EXCT or guest somewhere within the name, so people know that there's guests enabled. If it's something like a multinational, having the geography, the business unit, and then the descriptive name can be really useful. You might work in a very large company. There might be different HR teams in different kind of regions or geographies. Having that available is super useful. And then from Harvard or lots of schools, we have things like the school naming prefix, department name, and the descriptive name as well through here. So lots of kind of examples. Some other ones that we see as well from an access perspective, which can be really useful. So in a lot of organizations, when people are using teams for projects, some of them, what they do is to create an internal team as well as an external team. Now, I don't really like this approach. There's plenty other ways to get around this, but we do see with this a lot of customers where, let's say, the internal team has INET in front of it, whereas the client team might have like an _G or like a G in front of it. So they know that in this case, this is the internal team for Tesla Automotive, and this is the Tesla Automotive teams with guests also. Again, I'm not a huge fan of this. We do see this actually quite a lot, especially with kind of project-based organizations. But again, if you just had two teams called Tesla Automotive, right, you would have no idea which is the internal team versus which is the team with guests also. And just the final one really quickly, I've know we've gone through this as well, is through kind of region, location, or function based, right? We really like this idea of putting a function around a particular team. So projects, departments, loans, branches, if you work in a bank, for instance. And again, out of the box, if you're using out of the box Microsoft 365, there's really no way to be able to do this. You're going to have to build your own intake form or train your users or use something like a Power App where they can go choose from a series of values, and then you're going to go and add all of these teams names as well through here. All right, so that's a little bit about teams naming. So let's take it a level down and talk about channel naming as well. So I assume everyone's pretty familiar with the concept of channels. One of the things that I would say is far too many organizations and far too many teams don't use any channels at all, right? And that's really disappointing because channels can be super, super useful, not just to break up conversations and documents, but they can also be individually configured. Each channel has a specific email address as well, which is really great if you want to forward emails to these particular channels. And of course, you have things like channel-based calendars as well. So one of the best practice tips that we would recommend is make sure your teams have multiple channels, right? If you just have a bunch of teams with a single general channel, it can be really problematic because everyone puts every conversation within that general channel. You can't find anything. You have this huge kind of, bunch of conversations here. You got to scroll through them. It can be really painful. So again, having individual channels can be really useful. One of the things you do want to consider is remember your channel names are also going to be, or the name of that channel is going to be the same thing as the folder that's created within the shared documents library. So you have to think about that a little bit when you create those channel names also. So to channel name bad practices. So again, what we see a lot of is having just a single channel called general. Don't do that, right? Go and add additional channels to your teams. Again, lots of advantages to doing that. Really, really good advantages in terms of, again, being able to segregate conversations, even being able to control what you're actually interested in. So, instead of getting notifications just through the general channel, having notifications controlled at a channel basis can be something that's super useful. The other thing as well is having a channel called conversations, discussions, or announcements. It's not that useful because that's what the channels are for, to have conversations and discussions, for instance. So again, wouldn't recommend having those as channel names. And also make sure that your channel names are going to be distinct. So if you have a team like we have here, and one of the channels is called announcements, one of them is called communications, one of them is called discussions and news, it's very difficult for me to understand where the hell I go to get announcements and news, right? Do I go into the announcements channel? Do I go into news as a communications? So again, you want to make sure that those channel names are going to be distinct here also for you. A couple of other things in terms of the channel names. Acronyms, again, is a really, really common one we see people doing. It can work well in some organizations, again, if those acronyms are really, really well known. But if you're a new person and you jump into this team and these are the names of the channels, right? BBC, LLA versus this, which are actually the blown up names. I think this is a much nicer experience as well. So again, be mindful if you're putting in channels exactly if you're going to use acronyms through here. The other thing I also say is emojis. People love emojis in channel names. I'm not a huge fan of it personally. I think it could be useful. Just try to control yourself, people, and make sure that the emojis are actually useful. I mean, we see like unicorns and hamburgers and a whole bunch of other craziness. Maybe having like a news, a little bit of a newspaper for a news channel could be useful if you want to go down that approach. Having a little bit of an alert thing for like an alert channel could be useful also, again. And again, try not to make your channel names really, really long. We see some organizations that have these really long channel names. Again, it's too much. You have to think of it from like an intranet perspective. People make their intranet navigation with very short labels because people can just skim across that stuff. Or imagine applying that same approach to your teams as well. So what about some best practices? So the first thing is keep the name short and distinctive as well through here. So here we have a project workspace template, right? We have the general channel, which of course everyone needs to have. You can't remove this. You can't change the name of it. It is what it is. But then we've got a series of other channels whose purpose is all pretty self-explanatory, right? Nothing is here kind of confusing for people. Again, make sure each channel has a clear and direct purpose. The other thing is this kind of concept of Miller's magic number. So Miller's magic number is a gentleman called Miller, and he did a whole bunch of research in terms of how many things can people remember really quickly before they start to forget. And it turns out it's 7 plus or minus 2, right? So again, if you're skimming across a lot of teams, by the time you start kind of looking at all these channels, if the team has 20 channels, you would have forgotten what the top ones are typically by the time you get to that one as well. It's also the reason that if you see a lot of websites, they typically have between 5 and 9 items in the top level navigation menu as well. So again, that's why, because of all the research that this gentleman did. So again, try to limit the number of channel names that you have through here also. Some other best practices as well. Like I said, choose your emojis carefully, right? And don't go overboard. I don't think there's a reason that you need things like bears and unicorns and seals and all the other emojis within team names. Maybe you want to. I know I'm being a little bit facetious here, but again, just try to make sure you don't go a little bit crazy. The other thing we should also recommend is only letting team owners to be able to create channels. Now, out of the box by default, team members can also create channels as well. That could be a little bit problematic. The final thing is be careful with numbers. Now, I'm going to talk about this because everyone wants to have their channels organizing nicely, right? And they think what they can do is put names in front of the channels because they want to order them. Now, as you know, out of the box, there's no way to order channels within a team. It goes into alphanumeric order. We see there's a lot of people that try to put in naming policies to make sure that, again, these channels are called correctly. But what happens is you get into a situation like this, where how you think these channels are going to be ordered, they just aren't, right? It's an alphanumeric way that Teams shows you these channels. You can work this out. It's pretty problematic. What I would say is just understand you're not going to be able to control the order of these channels. It's even worse if you use emojis at the very beginning, because it uses the hex code from the emoji, and basically you have no idea what that is either. So again, from the channel ordering piece, what we would recommend is just understand you just can't really control this, right? And we see a lot of customers who do like first channel 01, second channel 02, and someone creates another channel called 1, and someone's like, great, I'm going to put in 10 here, but for some reason 10 comes before 5, right? It just gets really, really confusing for people. So again, what I would say is just understand you can't really control the names of these channels unless you're very, very, very specific. And we do see some customers where they have like 00001 and then 00002 in there also as well. All right. So now we're good with channels. Let's talk a little bit about tabs also. So again, in terms of tab naming, lots of best practices around this as well. Tabs are one of those things which, again, I think is just such a huge loss for organizations. Again, these tabs are tabs that you can add on top of each channel. It's incredibly useful because, again, it allows you to surface things like apps and contents within each channel. It's one of the reasons that you want to have channels, because each channel can be configured independently of each other. So again, when someone jumps into a channel, let's say for the general channel, and then they jump into a tasks channel, they could have a very, very different experience through there. Tabs are great. They allow you to provide context and information when you're in the channel. And they're a great way also to add third-party apps into Teams, because most of the apps are surfaced through channels here also. Some best practice tips. Again, you should be using tabs. And each channel we think should have an additional tab. And we'll talk about some of those kind of best practices also. Some of the things that people constantly ask about. So can you remove the posts or the file tab? The answer to that is not really, or not at all, right? Can you change the default tab that people land on when they click on the channel? The answer to that is no, not either. The other thing we get is, can you change the order of the posts and the file tab to make one come before the other? The answer to that is no as well. So it's pretty limited through there. Again, some channel best practices through here. I would definitely limit the use of emojis for tabs in particular. We find commonly it just don't look very good. I think it looks okay in channels and for Teams names, but for channel names, sorry, and for Teams names, but for tabs, it doesn't really actually look that great. Definitely remove tabs if you don't want to use them. Main one is the wiki. Everyone hates the Teams wiki, right? So you can definitely remove that as well. The other thing we'd also recommend is to change the default name. So if you have something like a document, instead of, calling it Word, for instance, put the name of the document in that tab so people know exactly what that is as well through here. Again, be careful about the length, right? What you'll find is that after about 20, these are going to be truncated also. Again, what we also say is every channel should have a custom tab, and try to have the tabs which you want more exposure to on the left-hand side. Because again, what you'll find again is tabs have a really bad habit of wrapping really, really easily. So you want to make sure that the stuff you want people to look at is the first tab after posts and files and wiki, if you have that. All right. Now we got all of these things. Let's talk about kind of bringing all of these things together and kind of structuring your teams with some sort of context. So again, the first thing that we would kind of recommend is making sure that different teams have different structures. There's no concept of a team, right? Really, that team should be dependent in terms of exactly what's going to happen within that team, right? So each team, like we say here, should be purpose and should be fit to purpose as well. So what we see a lot of is a lot of organizations using teams where they're creating a team. The only thing that's there is the general channel, and then they're having all of the conversations there, all of the documents are there, and it's not working very, very well. Now, in case if you want to know, teams, as you know, structures are composed of the team itself, the channels, the tabs, the apps, and the SharePoint site. We're not going to talk about the SharePoint site too much here, but they're the pieces that at least you can structure those. Some examples of kind of teams structures as well. So again, we really like the concept of teams templates. It's one of the things we do a ton of work here about Orchestra, because we believe when someone goes to teams, they don't want a team, they want something built for them to do something, right? So it could be a department, a division, a region, or an office-based team. Maybe you want to run a project, so you can have different types of project-based teams, internal projects, capital projects, external projects, for instance. We see a lot of organizations using teams for people or HR related activities now as well. So things like an onboarding team, an offboarding team, or recruitments, for instance. You might also want to have teams based on communication types of pieces. So things like crisis management or company communications can fit really well in this as well. Again, other types of teams can be process based. So things like a team for every merger or acquisition, a team for every store opening. If you're a retail department, maybe a construction team, or maybe a research team if you're something like a pharmaceutical industry. But really the idea is that teams are not just teams, right? They should be constructed and built to provide the capabilities in terms of the context of what people are trying to do. So some really quick best practices here. The first thing that we would say is please don't just have a general channel, right? I know a lot of people do this, again, because the out-of-the-box Teams templating capability isn't very, very good. But again, make sure that you add additional channels to your teams. The other thing that we would also recommend, so people start using those additional channels, is limiting who can post in the general channel, and typically using that general channel just from a communications perspective. You can easily go and do that by changing the channel settings as well through here. So again, the other thing we would also say is for the general channel, you at least want to have a link to the SharePoint homepage there and a link as well to the news archive as well. And these are two common tabs you can instantly add through there. Some other things in terms of channel-based practices for teams as well. So one of the things we would recommend is having like a help or training channel for each team. This can be incredibly useful where people are new to Teams, especially if you have your tabs, which are configured to show things like training materials or everything else. If you were in an amazing session earlier, which talked about shared channels, this is somewhere where a shared channel can be extremely effective. So imagine having a shared channel for like Teams training, and that shared channel was across all of your teams, and someone can go in and ask a question through that, and everyone can see the answers. It could be really, really useful. The other option as well is when you add a channel, you have the option whether to show it to members or not. So again, we always recommend that all of the channels should be shown to members. The reason for that is a lot of users just don't actually understand that you can hide and unhide them as well through here. The third thing that we would also recommend is having templates so you can control the structure of channels across teams. So again, in a lot of organizations, I might be a member of 3 different projects. So project team 1, project team 2, project team 3. I'm all doing the same types of activities across those projects, but because we have different project managers that called these channels different across different teams. And again, this is problematic because when I go from project team 1 to project team 2 to project team 3, even though I'm doing the same stuff, because the labeling's different, I have to try to work out what's going on. So again, having some consistency across these channel names, not only within a team, but across a team can be really, really useful. So standardize on what you're going to be calling the testing channel, right? Is it going to be QA? Is it going to be quality assurance? Is it going to be called testing? Whatever that is, standardize it and make sure that people know that that's the channel that they have to use also. Some other things around tabs as well. So some best practices for tabs. If you don't use the wiki tab, get rid of it. No one likes the Teams wiki, get rid of it anyway. I think Microsoft is drawn to that conclusion also as well. Again, important tabs should be on the left-hand side because they're the ones which are going to be shown first. And again, as I've mentioned, the general channel should always have homepage of the team site, news archive, and some important information here. And then the final thing as well, in terms of tabs in particular, is really using tabs and channels to highlight some important kind of functionality or content as part of the channel. So if you have a channel for tasks and timelines as part of the project, you should have whatever task management tool you're using there, right? Whether it's Planner or whether it's Microsoft List there also. If you have a channel to discuss change orders in a project, maybe have the change order form there so people know what that process is, or maybe a list of all of the change orders that are available there also. All right, so we've gone through all of these pieces. Let's kind of put all of these pieces together. and see how this all works in some real life scenarios. So first thing we're going to talk about is a project workspace template. So again, everyone does projects, and there's multiple different ways to run projects through Microsoft Teams. Again, we'll go through this. This is, we think, a really good example of some of the best practices in terms of channel namings and tabs and everything as well through there also. Next thing we're going to talk about is department team. So again, we have a department template that's part of Orchestra as well. Again, you can see exactly what's in here, the channels and all of those pieces. And the last thing is around an employee onboarding template. Now, this is a really interesting one. We're finding many more customers, and again, trying to onboard and offboard employees through Teams as well. All right, folks, let us jump into a demo here. And I apologize about my voice, but it is starting to go here. All right, friends, let us talk about this. All right, so this is Teams. I'm sure you're familiar with it. If not, then we have other bigger issues. Let's talk about some of the templates that we have here. So this is a template that comes with Orchestra for a project. Now, again, there's multiple different ways to structure projects, but we find this is a pretty good one. So again, here we have our project team. This in this organization, every project, it's going to be its own team, right? This team has a number of different channels. So we have the general channel, channel for deliverables, channel for help and support, like we talked about earlier, a channel for reports, and a channel for tasks and timelines. Not too many channels, nice short names, very obvious what the channel is for. I would be remiss if I'm looking for deliverables and I think they're in the tasks and timelines channel, for example. As we talked about across the top for the general channel, we have some fairly kind of specific pieces. So the first thing that we have, like we talked about, is having a link to the SharePoint homepage, right? Again, a lot of people are somewhat scared of letting their users know that a SharePoint site exists. We don't believe that. So having the SharePoint site integrated in with a page in the general channel can be super useful. And this is kind of the SharePoint homepage, right? For our particular project workspace through here. The next thing that we also try to do sometimes is having like a project status page, right? Again, project status is one of those things that you probably want to communicate. Well, wouldn't it be great if you had a tab across the top in the general channel? Because remember, that general channel is where most of the communication is going to happen. And you have, it could be a project status like a SharePoint page that we have here. Maybe the project status is going to be a link to a Word document. Maybe it's a link to another system, whatever that is, right? That can be super useful as well. The last thing that we have is a link to the meeting minutes. Now, one of the things we strongly recommend for our customers is to use OneNote from a note-taking perspective. But if you're going to do that, again, in having a meeting minutes tab linked up to OneNote with some sections and some tabs through here can be incredibly useful. So again, this project's documents one, this is a bit more of a streamlined search experience, and the team information is a custom Orchestra thing. But again, even if you just have home, project status, and meeting minutes here, can be really useful for your project workspace. If you have a channel for help and support, like a lot of people do, having links to various types of training materials that you have, Teams overview materials that you have here, right? There's a bunch of good stuff here that we can go. We don't want to go through that now, but we can. But again, if you've got a help and support channel, having that ability to have, help documentation already through, and it's kind of really nice here, even though we've got no conversations, I can come into here and maybe ask a help question. Now, this is a static channel at the moment, or a public channel, but this is really where a shared channel will come in to play also. And the last thing really quickly is around tasks and timelines. So again, if you're doing a project or any types of activities which has some sort of tasks, which is probably most of them, having a channel for tasks and timelines can be really useful. Again, you can have conversations around these tasks and timelines. But again, the other really brilliant thing about Teams in particular is you can actually show your tasks here. Now, whether they're in something like Planner, you can add this through here, whether it's something like Microsoft Lists, for instance, also, again, right, having those task management tools brought in can be really useful. And one of the other things that we commonly do as well, particularly from a help and training perspective, is you might have like a central training area for something like managing tasks. We'll have that in as part of your tasks and timelines, right? So again, you can kind of see exactly what you want here and shows you the options. Again, it's kind of providing users that experience through here. But again, pretty simple example, but a pretty well-maintained teams. Now, again, we probably have 70% of our customers, a couple of hundred customers using this project workspace template. Of course, they add their specific things, but this is a much better approach rather than just having a team with a general channel, right? Which is what they were doing previously. The next type of template we're going to talk about is an employee onboarding and onboarding template for teams also. So again, this is a really interesting one. We're starting to see a lot more of our customers and clients here trying to use teams for various different purposes, right? Not just projects and all of the common stuff, but some other pieces as well. So here, imagine having a template for a team that is going to be part of the onboarding process for new users within your organization. So every time someone goes and starts within an organization, a team is going to be created for that individual. In the general channel, again, we have our SharePoint site here, right, for this particular piece. If this is going to load here. Let's try this again here. Files. Let's go onboarding home. Come on, SharePoint. Okay, we'll come back to this. So here we do have a SharePoint site here that we can see all of the items. We might have something like a new hire checklist that's available here also. So again, we can see, actually, let's show you what this SharePoint site looks like if it doesn't want to open up in Teams. But here it's pretty simple, right? So we've got like an onboarding piece for a particular individual. We've got some quick links here, a new hire checklist, maybe the documents that people have to fill in, right? All of that good stuff. So again, here for, it doesn't want to load it. Here for the team, we've got posts, files, the onboarding home, the new hire checklist. And then we've also got channels for the particular types of activities that people have to do as part of that onboarding process. So maybe for HR, there's a link to the learning hub or the course catalogs. Maybe for mentoring, there's a way to find a mentor through here. Maybe for technology, a little bit of information around kind of using Microsoft 365 also. So again, pretty simple, but a pretty good example of structuring a team, again, to be fit to purpose for a particular task. And the other one that we'll go through really quickly is about a department team template. Again, we get asked a whole bunch of questions around this. You know, what should be in a department team? Do I even need a department team at all? We think the answer to that is yes. So again, for our department team, obviously we've got a SharePoint site, you know, some pretty simple things here, some department news, maybe a list of new starters within our organization, list to the calendar or to our home. But from a channel perspective and from a team's perspective, a couple of things that we think are really effective. Having a channel that you can ask leadership, right, can be really, really useful. So again, this is some way that the leadership of the department can communicate down to their department themselves. Having a kudos channel can be really, really useful as well. So people can talk about, you know, employees and share some good thoughts around them as well. The other thing we also like as well is having a staff updates channel. So, you know, as staff move, change, retire, what of that, you can have that as well. And then having a training and development channel for that department as well can be incredibly useful. So again, just having a little bit of structure, a little bit of tabs, again, much more useful and much more impactful than a team called Human Resources as a department, which is this, right? Just a general channel, no tabs, no anything, right? It just doesn't make any sense for people. So again, when you're looking at your templates, make sure you have specific templates for specific pieces, and also make sure you have some, you know, use some of those things that we talked about previously. All right, let's go back to the presentation here, folks, and we will wrap this up in just 1 second. All right, so there's some examples. So we talked about the employee onboarding team. We talked about the project workspace team as well. We talked about our department team. And we also talked about our employee onboarding team as well. So really, as kind of a quick takeaway for this, again, think about your teams in order to structure them effectively, right? Don't just go and create, you know, teams with a single channel and a single tab. Again, think about naming policies also. I know we didn't cover that too much within the demo, but again, you could see on the left-hand side that all of the teams that we had there, they're all correctly named. Even here, we have teams which are templates, right? So again, people can see that these are all template teams because they have TEMPL in front of them also. But again, making sure that you're using those naming conventions and policies also. And again, making sure you're adding structure to those teams, right? Additional tabs, additional channels, something more than the general channel also. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining this session. I know it's pretty late there. Well, not that late, but it's early afternoon there within Philly, so really appreciate it. If you want to provide any feedback, let me know. There's also a raffle here to win this thing. This thing seems very impressive. I would like this as well. I'm not sure what it is, but definitely feel free to go and kind of join the raffle as well through here. And again, register for some other pieces as well, yeah, which would be really, really useful as well. A couple of questions. So if anyone has any questions, let me know. Type them into the chat here. Also, a couple of questions that we have here. Let me just go back down. How many prefixes are too many? Thank you, Joy Apple. Fantastic questions. Fantastic question. So as again, we would probably say limit it to a static prefix on the type and then a couple of additional pieces of information. And again, we'd say kind of limit that to kind of 12 characters overall. So don't have too many there as well. In terms of the second question, I know you and Tony here had a little bit of a discussion. Should IT be in charge of naming conventions or the business? IT should have standards. Business should understand why those exist. They both should collaborate. Absolutely right, Tony. I think both of them need to kind of understand and collaborate on what those things are, right? So again, just to help people understand exactly why they've been asked to enter in additional information, what are the long-term effects on all of those pieces as well. Thoughts on opulous suffixes and naming convention? I definitely wouldn't do that. I think whoever came up with that probably isn't sane, to be honest with you. So I would definitely be concerned if someone is proposing that as a naming convention. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. I apologize for my lack of energy through here as well. Again, if you have any questions, thoughts, feedback, you want to get in touch with myself, just feel free to reach out to me as well. Thank you so much for having me and enjoy the rest of your day.